The most dangerous presidential decisions in American history. Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. When the Civil War erupted, the Union was falling apart, and Washington, D.C. was almost surrounded by slave states. In Maryland, riots in Baltimore had turned violent. Union troops were attacked as they tried to pass through. Lincoln feared the capital could be cut off entirely if Maryland joined the Confederacy. His response was drastic. He suspended habeas corpus, the right that protects citizens from being imprisoned without charge or trial. Suddenly, soldiers could arrest anyone suspected of disloyalty, politicians, journalists, or ordinary citizens, and hold them indefinitely. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled this unconstitutional in Ex parte Merryman. But Lincoln ignored the ruling, arguing extraordinary times required extraordinary powers. 2 years later, Congress passed the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, giving him legal cover after the fact. Thousands were jailed without trial, but Lincoln believed it was necessary to preserve the Union. His decision permanently expanded presidential emergency powers and set a precedent that still echoes today. James K. Polk provokes war with Mexico. President Polk came into office with one clear goal: expand America from coast to coast. He wanted California and the Southwest, but Mexico wouldn't sell. When Texas joined the Union, a border dispute flared between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Polk sent General Zachary Taylor's troops into the contested zone, fully aware it would provoke a reaction. When Mexican cavalry attacked, Polk told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil. That phrase ignited the nation. Congress declared war. But the truth was murkier. Those soldiers had been fighting on land both countries claimed. The Mexican-American War ended in U.S. victory and massive territorial gains. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. But it came at the cost of tens of thousands of lives and deep political division. Polk got his empire, but he did it by manipulating the nation into war, a war he had planned from the start. Andrew Jackson defies the Supreme Court. In the 1830s, Georgia began seizing Cherokee land, even though the Cherokee had a written constitution, schools, and a government recognized by treaties. The Cherokee sued, and in Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions were illegal. But President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. The quote often attributed to him, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," may be apocryphal, but the defiance was real. Jackson had already signed the Indian Removal Act 2 years earlier, and he continued pushing tribes westward. The result was the Trail of Tears, a forced march of thousands of Cherokee from their homeland to what is now Oklahoma. Nearly a quarter died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Jackson's refusal to uphold the Supreme Court's authority weakened the judiciary and sanctioned one of the greatest human rights abuses in American history. Harry S. Truman uses atomic weapons. In August 1945, President Truman faced a nightmare choice: invade Japan at the cost of potentially 1 million lives, or use a new weapon of unimaginable power. He chose the bomb. Hiroshima was destroyed instantly, with around 80,000 people killed in seconds. Tens of thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed from burns and radiation. 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit, killing roughly 40,000 more. Most of the victims were civilians, families, workers, and children. Truman believed the bombings would end the war quickly, sparing lives on both sides. Critics argue Japan was already near surrender and that a demonstration strike could have been enough. Whether one sees it as a necessary evil or a moral catastrophe, the decision changed history forever. It ended World War II, but began the nuclear age, where humanity gained the power to destroy itself. Franklin D. Roosevelt orders Japanese-American incarceration. After Pearl Harbor, fear and racism swept the West Coast. Military officials warned of potential sabotage and demanded the removal of Japanese Americans. Despite opposition from some advisors, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942. More than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to internment camps surrounded by barbed wire and guards. There was no evidence of disloyalty, no trials, no charges. Families lost everything: homes, businesses, and dignity. Roosevelt framed it as a wartime necessity, but decades later, the government admitted it was driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The U.S. formally apologized in 1988, but the stain on civil liberties remains permanent. Lyndon B. Johnson escalates Vietnam. In August 1964, President Johnson told the nation that North Vietnamese boats had attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin twice. The second attack never happened, but Johnson used it to secure sweeping war powers from Congress. With that authority, he massively escalated the conflict. Over the next few years, more than 500,000 American troops were sent to Vietnam. The war became a bloody quagmire that killed nearly 60,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. At home, protests erupted, cities burned, and trust in government collapsed. Johnson privately doubted the war could be won, but he kept doubling down, unwilling to look weak. The deception surrounding Tonkin and the scale of escalation turned Vietnam into one of America's greatest tragedies, a war started in confusion and sustained by politics. Richard Nixon covers up Watergate. In 1972, a group tied to Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. When the burglars were caught, Nixon tried to contain the damage, but his cover-up became worse than the crime. He used the CIA to block the FBI investigation, paid hush money, and lied to the American people. When prosecutors demanded the White House tapes, Nixon ordered them fired, triggering the Saturday Night Massacre. His Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General resigned in protest. The Supreme Court later ordered the tapes released, proving Nixon's direct involvement in obstruction of justice. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned in August 1974. The Watergate scandal exposed just how fragile democracy can be when a president puts himself above the law. James Buchanan does nothing as the Union dissolves. Few presidents did more damage by doing less. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, Southern states began seceding, starting with South Carolina that December. President Buchanan declared secession illegal, but claimed he had no power to stop it. He refused to reinforce federal forts or mobilize the military. While he waited, 7 states left the Union, seized federal property, and organized a new government. By the time Buchanan left office, the Confederacy was armed and ready for war. His passivity in the face of national collapse gave the secessionists time to prepare and made civil war inevitable. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is refusing to make one at all. John Adams signs the Alien and Sedition Acts. In 1798, as tensions with France rose, Congress passed a series of laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. They made it a crime to criticize the government and allowed the president to deport non-citizens deemed dangerous. Adams, who had the power to veto the bills, signed them instead. The acts were quickly weaponized against political opponents. Newspaper editors were jailed simply for criticizing the president. The backlash was fierce. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison condemned the laws as unconstitutional and warned they threatened the republic's core freedoms. The acts expired within a few years, but the damage was done. Adams's fear of instability led him to sacrifice liberty for control, and the American commitment to free speech barely survived its first real test. Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal government. When Woodrow Wilson took office in 1913, African Americans had been working alongside white colleagues in federal jobs for decades. Wilson changed that. His administration resegregated federal offices, dismissing and demoting black employees. In 1915, The White House hosted a private screening of The Birth of a Nation, a film that glorified the Ku Klux Klan and portrayed Black Americans as villains. Wilson's reported praise of the film is disputed, but the damage was real. The screening gave legitimacy to racist ideology and helped fuel the Klan's revival. By enforcing segregation at the highest levels of government, Wilson reversed decades of progress and lent official credibility to white supremacy that would haunt the country for generations. Andrew Johnson sabotages Reconstruction. After Lincoln's assassination, the task of rebuilding the South and protecting freed slaves fell to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat with deep racial prejudice. Johnson quickly issued mass pardons to former Confederates, restored their property, and allowed Southern legislatures to pass black codes that effectively re-enslaved freed people through legal loopholes. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and opposed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship to freedmen. Congress overrode his vetoes, but the damage was done. White supremacist groups rose with impunity. Violence spread, and Reconstruction collapsed. Johnson was impeached, but narrowly escaped removal. His refusal to protect newly freed Americans doomed the South to nearly a century of segregation and racial terror. George W. Bush invades Iraq. After the attacks of September 11th, President George W. Bush launched the war in Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda. But in 2003, he shifted focus to Iraq, claiming Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence was weak, but the administration insisted the threat was real. The invasion began in March 2003. Saddam's regime collapsed quickly, but no WMD stockpiles were ever found. What followed was years of insurgency, civil war, and chaos. Over 4,000 Americans died, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed, and trillions were spent. The war destabilized the region and helped create the conditions for ISIS to rise a decade later. Bush's decision, based on faulty intelligence and rushed judgment, became one of the most consequential foreign policy mistakes of the 21st century. Franklin D. Roosevelt tries to pack the Supreme Court. By 1937, FDR had won a landslide re-election and pushed through sweeping New Deal programs, but the Supreme Court kept striking them down. Frustrated, he proposed adding up to 6 new justices for every sitting member over age 70 who didn't retire, claiming it was to help the aging court keep up with its workload. Everyone knew the truth. Roosevelt wanted to reshape the court to approve his policies. The plan was so controversial, it even split his own party. Congress rejected it, and Roosevelt's popularity dipped sharply. Though he eventually appointed new justices through natural turnover, the episode tarnished his legacy and served as a warning about the dangers of tampering with the separation of powers. Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra. In the 1980s, President Reagan promised never to negotiate with terrorists or fund illegal wars. Yet his administration did both. Officials secretly sold weapons to Iran, then under an arms embargo, in hopes of freeing American hostages in Lebanon. The profits were illegally funneled to the Contras, rebel fighters in Nicaragua, despite a congressional ban. When the operation was exposed, Reagan initially denied knowing about the arms sales, then admitted he had authorized them but not the diversion of funds. Several top officials were convicted, though many sentences were later overturned or pardoned. The scandal damaged Reagan's credibility and revealed how far a president's team could go when operating in the shadows. It showed that even noble goals can lead to lawless actions, and that the ends don't justify the means. These decisions show that danger in leadership doesn't always come from bad intentions. It comes from power unrestrained. Some of these presidents acted out of fear, others out of conviction, and some out of arrogance. But each choice reshaped America and left scars that lasted generations. Which one do you think was the most dangerous? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow.